Sim Racers, today you are going to learn how to set up your car in sim racing or racing in real life. We're gonna go through the most important things for you to know what to look for when you're playing with the setups, because the most terrible thing initially is to not know exactly what you want to do and you just get scared and you never learned, which is totally fine if you're a beginner. Like, I would say you can play for 6 months to a full year without ever thinking about setup, because there are fixed series, there are setups available. You don't have to learn how to do the setups yet. You have to learn car handling first, and this is actually one of the first things that I want to talk about with you guys. First of all, let's break the myth that you cannot be fast without a good setup. The truth here is a fast driver with any setup will be faster than a slow driver with a good setup. The driving technique will be worth like 20 seconds. If you don't know how to drive fast, you will be 20 seconds slower. You start learning and then you gain those seconds until you reach a point, and that is essentially around 1 second slower. We're talking about the same fuel. A regular baseline setup will not be more than like 5/10 slower than a very good setup. Maximum a second. If you're like 2 seconds slower, you're not gonna find that time in setup only. If you try to find that time through setup, it's not gonna be the most efficient way for you. So driving technique comes before that. Student question: when learning a new combo, if the car is understeering or oversteering a lot, should I change the setup straight away or learn to deal with it before changing? If you're my student, you know my answer. I want you to know how to induce oversteer and induce understeer through driving only. This is very important. If you can't induce oversteer anywhere or induce oversteer anywhere just by adjusting your driving inputs, changing setup, it's not gonna help as much, because the setup can only be felt perfectly. You can change the setup and feel the difference if you know how to induce more rotation, how to induce less rotation, because then you can really like notice the subtle differences. Sometimes you see people talking about like changing a click or two. Like, you will never feel the difference of a click or two if you don't know how to induce understeer, induce oversteer, so you can really feel and know exactly how the car is responding on a subtle level to your inputs. And if you're a beginner, this might sound like black magic initially. It's gonna get better. It's just like you just need more track time and you're gonna get like fluent in the technique and you're gonna feel these differences. And then it's gonna make sense when you talk about a click or two. But it doesn't have to make sense yet. The idea for this video today is to show you extreme differences. So I'm gonna show you when to change the setup, at what stage of the corner, and what types of corners, so that you feel the extremes. And then after you feel those extremes, with time, you're gonna be able to feel more subtle differences. This guide is the foundation of car setup. It's an ultimate guide for beginners. I won't go into too much detail. If you want to get deeper into a specific topic, do your own research, but you're gonna come out of this video with a basic understanding of the functionality of it. It's not gonna be black magic anymore. I'm reading some questions from students here. What is the goal of this setup? How should I feel it? How do I know that the changes are better? And how do I know that the changes will be fast or slow besides trial and error? You won't. You have to try it. The thing about setup is you have an idea. You have a suspicion. Oh, I'm oversteering on high speed. I'm going to change a little bit the wing. You still have to go there and try it. If you're very experienced, then you can quickly like get the right change. But you will never know if you don't do trial and error. So trial and error is the way to go. In the sim, you can do that infinite amount of time. In real life, it's more tricky. You have to be very informed of the changes that you're doing, because if it's a really bad change, you can crash, so not ideal. But trial and error is the way to go. The best guide for your setup changes are consistency and delta. If your setup makes you a lot more consistent, that might be a good thing. If your setup makes your delta go green, that might be a good thing. You, of course, want both at the same time. That's the trickiest thing to do. Sometimes if you're not used to an oversteer setup, oversteer setups will be faster, but then you won't be as consistent because you can't still dance with the car as much, and you end up doing a very fast lap and then spinning and so on. But a good setup is fast and consistent. Can a setup improve your lap time and consistency at the same time? For example, let's talk about an oversteer setup. Like, it's too oversteering. So you try to do changing the setup to make the car a little bit more planted. It might be a little bit slower, but for you, over the course of a lap, because you're going to be more consistent, it might pay off, and you might, over the course of a whole race, be faster because you're making less mistakes. So in your case as a beginner, you might add a little bit of rear wing. For example, my real life team, RicePack, they added a little bit of wing for me when I was testing the radical, because I'm a new driver. And they're like, okay, we don't want to get like a new driver who never drove a radical before in an oversteer radical doing 200 kph. It's difficult to get a setup that's consistent and fast at the same time. And the only way you're going to get a fast setup and be consistent with it is through understanding your driving technique, is through understanding why you're losing the rear in some places and how you can correct it. And that's all driving technique. That's why I'm saying like driving technique is more important. You can be a little bit more aggressive in quali and then a lot safer in the race. I don't recommend making big changes between quali and race, because you want to have a very consistent behavior, predictable behavior. You don't want to like jump from quali to race and then the car just doesn't turn and you go straight out of the corner. So a car that's very understeer is also not good, because understeer is bad. I'm just talking about like too much oversteer. If you can't handle it, then maybe in the race you got a click of wing and you're gonna be a little bit more planted. Would you rather change the setup to make it optimal, faster, and try to adapt to it, or make it more comfortable to you? I, as a coach, want you to be out of your comfort zone. If you're in practice, if you have the time, get an oversteer setup and try to deal with it. Worst thing that can happen is you're gonna crash in the wall and reset. That's fine. In iRacing, you can drive the Skip Barber, the Ray FF1600, and these cars are super oversteery. You have to deal with it right away on the beginner cars. So when you move to a different class, you're already gonna be more used to it. You have to be consistent with oversteery cars. This is a prerequisite. And generally that happens when you turn the steering less. That's a very important thing to know. If you turn the steering less, if you don't like abuse the steering, an oversteer car is going to make a lot more sense to you, because you're going to turn less. Oh, it's already oversteering. Of course, it still takes time for you to get to that moment where you can deal with the oversteer. How to test the setup changes. Do at least 3 laps to test something that you're doing. Like you're changing wings, you're changing this or that. Don't judge the setup change in the out lap, because you're still on cold tires, because you're still adapting to it, because you need to adjust your driving to the new setup sometimes. Sometimes when you change a setup, it's a concept that you change, and then you have to change a lot of other things around it to make that concept work and be faster. So I already found myself doing a change, and then it was slower, but I was like, but this makes sense. I'm gonna change something else. And then like you're doing combinations of changes to make that first change work, and then you measure it. So setup can be very tricky, because you can get into a rabbit hole of changing too many things and then get lost. So you have to be careful with that. You change the concept, then second, third change, then you go back to the original one, and then you see how it goes. You have to always go back to your best lap setup, and sometimes just go back to some previous setup that you didn't test. Like that's why it requires so much time. You have to be testing a lot of stuff. You have to name all your setups. You make a change, you save it as a different, like V1.0, V1.1, V1.2, and so on. So you have to make these changes and remember what you're doing so that you don't get lost. Where to start with the car setup? This is where we actually start, because we're gonna talk about mechanical grip stuff, we're gonna talk about downforce stuff, and we're gonna talk about mixed stuff. So mixed means it affects both the mechanical grip but also the aerodynamic grip. Let's start with the rake. Rake is the difference between the ride height on the rear tires and the ride height on the front tires. So let's say we have a little car here. The ride height is how tall the car is literally. If this is very high, let's call it 80 millimeters, and this is 40 millimeters, then we have 40 millimeters of rake. What happens with the car when you change the rake? In iRacing, we are gonna change the spring perch offset here to change the ride height of the car. So as you can see here, we have 61.9 on the front, left front, right front, and we have 77 in the rear. So if I want the car to be safer, more understeery, I'm going to decrease the rake. So I'm doing this essentially. I'm gonna bring the car down. The weight of the car is being distributed slightly more towards the rear, so there's more weight, more grip on the rear tires, and the wind on the car is a little bit more slim, so there's less drag. So a car with less rake, like this, let's make a very aggressive one. Low rake. The car is supposed to be very understeering because there's a lot more weight now on the rear tires. I'm gonna try to rotate the car. Of course, I can still spin if I want, because I still, with driving technique, I can still induce oversteer or induce understeer. But what I can see from driving this is that, you see, it starts pushing mid-corner. It doesn't want to continue rotating. And this is one thing that I see a lot with rake. Rake helps the car maintain or increase the rotation. You see, like with less rake, the car does not want to get any more rotation. It wants to go straight, essentially. So I can try as much as I want. Let me try to spin here. Yeah, you can still spin with the car, especially on cold tires, if you really force it. And it's going to be slightly faster on the straights. So this is important. Like, you have to remember that rake also affects the downforce and the drag. Now we're gonna do the opposite. A lot of rake. See, what I'm looking here, guys, is the right height. It's not the spring perch offset. So I'm decreasing the value of the offset to increase the right height. This is very important. It's the actual height that I'm changing. This is the number that I'm looking at. I'm gonna go for maximum rake here. I'm gonna try to drive similarly, but you will pretty much quickly see that the car will oversteer a lot more, and then I'm gonna have to correct it a lot more. It's already a little bit more nervous, especially on lower speeds. I can see that the car really wants to go. It's really more oversteering because of the rake. What happens if there's too much rake? So if there's too much rake, the car is going to be too oversteery and it's going to be slow on the straights. But it might be the fastest setup. Maybe the fastest setup is the highest rake possible. Sometimes it happens. But here's the thing with the rake, though. The rake changes. So if you're stopped, the car's like that. But on higher speeds, you have a lot of wind, a lot of air pushing the car down in different ways. And it's not going to just push the car like that. It depends a lot on how much downforce you have on each end. The car stopped and the rake is 80, 60. Now, when the car starts getting air on top of it, it will start pushing the car down, but it pushes the entire body in different ways. So if you have a big wing here, let's say like you have absolutely no downforce on the front and you have a huge wing in the rear, what happens? The air is pushing the car down, right? And the force pushing the spring here will make the spring here compress. So this end of the car, because there's so much wind on the rear tires, it's gonna make the car do this on higher speeds. So the car can be like that. The car starts gaining speed and the air is like really pushing it, and then the rake is totally different at high speeds. So a car with a huge downforce level on the rear could bring this number down to 60. And now you have a car that is, of course, this is still going down a little bit, so let's call it like 55. It's gonna go 55 here and 60 here. This car has a lot of rake when it's stopped, but it has a lot less rake when it's at high speeds. This is what we're gonna call dynamic rake. Dynamic rake is the rake values at each speed. Stopped car has a specific value, medium speed has a specific value, and high speed has a specific value. So the more speed, the more the car will compress. Now, what is going to dictate the dynamic rake the most? I told you here, I gave you the example of a big wing, but be careful. It's not the downforce level that is gonna be the biggest driver of dynamic rake. It's actually the spring rate. The spring is literally this, right? So it compresses. If you add a soft spring, let's make a big spring here, a soft spring on the rear tires and a very stiff spring on the fronts, then the wind at higher speeds will be able to push the rear end a lot more, and the dynamic rake will be a lot more present. So the spring rates will affect the dynamic rake of the car big time. Is there a way to measure the dynamic rake? Yes. Telemetry software, you can measure the right height of each of the ends at different speeds. So you can definitely find that. It's a little bit like, I mean, if you want to get there, it's a little bit more geek, you know, like for telemetry. You can also just feel it. Like, for example, let's say the car is understeering at high speeds. What you can do is you soften the spring rate of the front so that this spring can be more compressed at higher speeds, and the car has more rake at higher speeds, and the car is gonna be more oversteery at high speeds. It's gonna rotate more at higher speeds. What is an ARB? The springs are here and they act independently, so the car can do whatever you want, because this spring compresses and this spring extends, so we have the car rolling to one side or the opposite, or these two springs compress and these two springs go up, so we have the car pitching, so it's moving that way. This is with springs. Now, an anti-roll bar is anti-roll. It prevents the car from tilting and rolling too much like that. So what is the idea behind them? They will not affect dynamic rake, you see, because the car is still free to move naturally like that. If you change the ARB, it's gonna be a mechanical only change. So if you want to change something and you don't want to affect different corners at low speed, high speed, medium speed, ARB is gonna be your safest approach. Now, what adjustments do we want? If we get this stiff, it's gonna prevent rolling, and there's gonna be a lot less weight transfer to the side. I mean, I just told you that there is no weight transfer, but it's just a way to explain. And the car will have a little bit less front end grip. It's gonna be a more consistent but lower level of grip. And then the car will understeer. So if you stiffen the ARB, you will get less rotation on the front tires. If you get this soft ARB, you will get more oversteer, more rotation. Now, rear tires. If we get the rear ARB and if it is stiff, the car will oversteer more because there's going to be a little bit less overall grip on the rear tires, although it's more consistent. So you get the car a little bit more rotatey, but at the same time more predictable. And no one talks about this. If you get it soft, you'll get overall more grip. But when you lose it, you lose it. So, cool thing that you can do with ARBs. I noticed that ARBs are very important under braking on the front ARB. So if you want to affect the balance of the car under braking on the entry of the corner, then change this ARB. It's going to be more important than changing this one. If you want to affect the balance of the car more on the exit, when you're getting the power down, you're accelerating, then you want to change the rear ARB a little bit more. The effects of changing ARB front and rear will be felt everywhere, but it's gonna be more pronounced at the end that is being used the most. So if you're accelerating, then you're getting this ARB to act a little bit more because there's literally more force against these two tires on power. So if you want the car to oversteer a little bit more, it's too understeer, I want the car to really like let go a little bit more to be a little bit faster, then you stiffen the rear tires on exit, right? But if the car, say you're turning into that corner, right-hander, and you're always locking up these tires, locking up the inside front, it's a great change to soften the ARB. Why is that? Because the ARB prevents roll, right? Remember? But what you're gonna do with that is you're gonna have a little bit more grip on the front tires. The car is gonna rotate a little bit more, and there's gonna be more responsiveness without you having to force the tires, and you end up not locking the tires because of that. So make sure that if you're adjusting the ARB on entry, adjust the front one first. If you're adjusting the ARB because you're struggling with something on the exit, then adjust the rear ones first. Higher number means stiffer, and if I want to do like 5-1, then I'm definitely getting a lot less rotation. So let's test the extremes. In the front, you can see ARB size. We can go from disconnected, which is absolutely no ARB and the tires are completely free, there's a lot of roll, or extra hard, where the car really does not roll that much and the tires kind of want to go with the roll and they prevent it from happening. So the car it bounces a lot more and so on. So we're gonna try first disconnected and XX hard. So disconnected on the front, that means super soft, and hardest possible on the rear tires, so we can see how the car behaves. So let's see here how it behaves. See, the front just goes. If I want the car to rotate with this configuration, it's gonna be incredibly responsive. Of course, maybe too much. It's way too much front. It just goes wherever I go. Like, there's no understeer. Of course, I can still induce understeer. Let me tell you something. You can get a very oversteery setup and still understeer if you know how to adjust your driving. I'll have to always remember that. But trying to go as fast as possible, this car will get a lot of rotation and spin. So this is soft ARB on the front and hard ARB on the rear tires. Now we're gonna try the opposite. We're gonna do extra hard on the front ARB and disconnect the rear ARB. When you have a very stiff ARB on the front and a very soft ARB on the rear, you can lift the front tire because the ARB is trying to prevent the roll, but if the car is light enough, it actually lifts the tire. I think there's a cool picture that we can show some pictures in the video, Andrew, of like a car with like a stiff ARB and a soft rear will lift the front tires while turning, while trail braking, because it's just like there's just so much. It's so stiff in the front and so soft in the rear that it allows the roll to happen in the rear. But because the car is preventing the roll from happening on the front, the front is lifted. It's funny that like this car on cold tires is still oversteering, even with like incredibly stiff. Oh, but I'm locking the... Oh, okay, now I'm understeering. You can see that. And if you hear it, I'm actually locking the front tires under braking. Remember I told you? It's very easy to lock the front tires if you have a stiff ARB. Look at that, I'm barely braking. And I'm locking the front left because the ARB is way too stiff. Because at an extreme level, it would even lift the tires. So remember that. ARB stiff on the front helps you lock up too much. So be careful with stiffening the front ARB too much. I guess we got it. When I'm driving on the limit, there's less of an indication of when the car is about to go with softer ARB. That is correct. Yes, that's true. Like with a stiffer ARB, the car starts skidding and slipping before it slides. Cars with soft ARB, they go more quickly to the slide phase. So when you lose the rear, you lose it more aggressively. It's more snappy. And with a stiffer car, you can start losing it and you notice it and you dent with it and you're not getting too much in that dangerous zone of the point of no return. Do you think we can see the tire lifting in this? Yeah, we can see it. Only if it's like actually jumping. So right now we can see that this tire is off the ground. Tiny bit. That's a very, very extremely subtle example of why probably without the ARB, it would not lift that much. It would still like stay in contact with the ground. So yeah, if this is happening, it's probably because of the ARB being extra stiff on the front tires. Next up, we have spring rates. Spring. You can adjust the rate of the springs independently, but we don't do that much. We generally change both fronts and both rears and keep them symmetrical. Some setups don't even allow you to independently change them. Some setups allow you to independently change them. The spring will act exactly like the ARB when it comes to lateral roll. So stiffer spring, less roll, softer spring, more roll. It does act to prevent roll like this, but because it allows the entire body to go down or up, it affects that. It will also control pitch, whether the car is doing this or that, which is affecting the rake, remember? So the dynamic rake is heavily affected by how soft or stiff the springs are. We are going to change the springs in a similar manner to ARBs. If you soften the front springs, the car will get more rotation. So it's going to get more oversteer. This means the car points more with less steering. The car is really responsive. You turn a little bit and you already get this. So softer spring, you get more rotation, and softer spring in the rear tires, you get less rotation. So a good way to remember this is softness equals grip. This is a way to remember. Don't take this religiously. It's just a memorization technique. Softness means grip. So if you want more grip on the front tires, then you want to put this soft. If you want more grip on the rear tires, then of course the car is going that way. Then you want to make this soft to make the car safer and more understeer or less oversteer. So basically less rotation. The thing though is that the springs, they control the ride height of the car depending on the speed. Remember? That means when you start getting at higher speeds, 100, that was 160, 200, 300, then the stiffness will control the rake of the car. So that's the dynamic rake. So sometimes you change the spring expecting a mechanical change, but you also affect the aerodynamic change on higher speeds a little bit too much. This is the cool thing about the spring and the dynamic rake is that when you change the spring for more grip, so let's say you add more grip on the front, so softer front, soft front. At high speeds, the dynamic rake is also gonna add more grip to the front tires. So in a way, you get really the effects that you want. So it's very easy to feel that you're getting more grip on higher speeds with a softer spring because those two things add up. In high speeds, soft fronts will also be better. What is better than what? You need a comparison. So here's the thing, like better, it depends so much on the window of operation that you have in each car, the regulation that you have for that series. So if you have, for example, a series that regulates stiffness, let's say like this car can go from 1 to 10, right? Stiffness. And then that series runs between 7, 8, and 9. It's literally illegal to use 6. You cannot use less than 6. So this will be considered a soft spring and this will be considered a hard spring, because that's within the window of the agreed operation window that you can use. If we lower spring rate, do we have to increase the ride height? If you want to maintain, that's a good question. That's a very good question. Whenever you soften the spring rate, because there's already weight, static weight on the car, it's gonna compress the car down more. So the car literally goes down a little bit. Let me see if I can show this in the game. So we're standing down here and this is how the car is looking. Okay, keeping this. Now we're going to change the spring rate a lot. This is the softest spring possible and this is how it looks. Now I'm gonna get and stiffen the spring rate on the front tires all the way. Stay in the car. I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna try to see if there's a difference. Oh my god, it's such a tiny difference. Okay, guys, look at the foot of the pit guy. Now look at the splitter. The splitter is a little bit under the foot. You see? This is with the softest spring rate. Now look at that. You see? Now this is with the stiff spring rate on the front tires. I didn't change the rake, but because I changed the spring rate, the ride height naturally changed. And now you can see that the splitter is a little bit more aligned with the foot of the pit guy. That's how tiny the difference is. If it's visual, it's big, because generally these changes are in millimeters and they have a crazy impact in the car balance. So if you can see visually a change in rake, that means there's going to be a huge difference in car behavior as well. I'm talking about springs in a way that relates the front to rear and the balance, but you can also ask yourself, wait, what about all for stiff or all for soft? So let's talk about that. What is faster, all soft or all stiff? Well, that really depends a lot on the track. If it's a flat track with not a lot of bumps, not a lot of curbs, you can go a little bit more towards the softer, but not too much. It really depends. You have to test it out. Remember, test it out. If the track has a lot of bumps, you have to test it out. It depends a lot on the track. No track is going to be flat. Some tracks are going to have lots of bumps. Yeah, Sebring. Okay, Sebring. If you have like a lot of bouncing because the track is full of bumps. Then you want to stiffen the springs so the car doesn't bottom out when you land. So you jump, as soon as you land, you don't want to do that. So you want to prevent the car from bottoming out by stiffening the springs. Or if the track is incredibly smooth, flat, then you really don't need to stiffen the springs that much. But remember that there are many factors. Remember that we can also stiffen the springs to have a car that's a little bit more predictable, that starts sliding a little bit without suddenly losing it. So there are so many factors weighing in, and you have to do the trial and error and see what's more comfortable and faster. Remember, consistency and speed. This video is in order of priority. So rake first, always. It's like the simplest way to see the difference in balance. Then ARB is the simplest way without affecting too many things. And then spring rates. That's what we're talking about right now. Now we're gonna talk about dampers. Dampers. I'm gonna explain with my hands. It's gonna be easier. If you have a car that only has springs, you jump. The spring is extended after as soon as you're in the air, the spring is extended. As soon as you land, you're gonna compress the spring. But what happens when you're bottoming out? The spring is compressed at the peak. It's gonna wanna push back. So it pushes back, but by the time you go past the point of resting, the resting point, it still has energy and it still goes up. So it's going past the resting point. Now it's extending. And then because it's extending, it's pulling back now. It's gonna pull back. The car is going down. Resting point still has energy. It's gonna continue going. So you go into this motion of a car with no dampers continues going. What is the function of the damper? It slows down the movement. Think of honey, a very viscous liquid, and put a spring inside the honey. The honey is gonna prevent it from moving up and down past its rest point, because it's gonna slow down its thing until it reaches the spot where it's resting. Now there's no force acting on it, and then it stops. So a spring in air is like consistently. It's terrible. You would be bouncing forever. It would be terrible to drive. A spring with honey in it, a spring inside a honey bottle is like stops. Why? Because there's a viscous liquid preventing the oscillation from the spring. That is a damper. I don't recommend too much playing with dampers before playing with ARB, springs, rakes, and wings. I'm gonna talk about wings after. The dampers also act as, we can call it rate for stiffness. So you can make the damper soft or hard. So generally a higher value is harder, or it slows down the speed of the suspension. If you have a hard dampening, lots of dampening on the front tires, you have understeer. Just like ARB, just like springs. You see? Soft, more grip, hard, less grip. The thing though is that when is this damper acting? Because right now, if we're adding weight to the front tires and compressing the spring, then there's gonna be a damper inside here that is gonna control how much it compresses. And that's what we're gonna call a compression damper. Will control how quickly or slowly the springs will compress. The cool thing about dampers is that they can have a different speed control for when the springs are extending, and that's what we're gonna call rebound damper. So you can have compression or extension or rebound. The naming here, we're gonna see comp or bump for compression, bump or compression or comp, and for extension we're gonna see generally rebound or RBD if you're driving like so of course. You can have the bump that controls the speed of compression, and you can have the rebound that controls the speed of extension. What you can do if you want the car to be a little bit more understeering, under braking on turn N with the weight on the fronts. Remember, if you're turning in, you're braking, and then you're starting to turn, you're releasing your brakes, but there's still a little bit of weight on the front tires. This is all controlled by the bump. So bump or compression damper, this is controlled on front tires on entry. This is where you get the biggest effects. So stiffer, more understeer. Soft, grip. Stiff, no grip. And then for the rear tires, you see the bump or compression acts exactly like the ARB and exactly like the springs. So same thing in the rear. If the bump on the rear is stiff, you get less grip on the rear tires. Or if it's soft, you get more compliance. The suspension compresses more quickly because it's softer and there's more grip. So the cool thing, remember that when you're braking and you're going that way and you're turning and you're trail braking to the corner, there's still some weight on the front tires. The compression on the front tires, comp or bump, is at the same time the extension of the rear tires. So rebound. So you have bump on the front acting because it's controlling how the suspension is going down. But at the same time, the rebound or the extension of the rears is being controlled by the rebound damper. So you see, when you start braking, you activate the bump on the front and the rebound on the rears at the same time. When you start accelerating, it's the opposite. When you start accelerating, the weight goes this way, right? So you get compression here and rebound here, and you can control that as well. So the same effects, the compression here will also be on the rebound here. So you can just always invert them. But yeah, for the compression, stiffer on the front will mean understeer, softer on the front will mean oversteer. And then compression here, stiffer will mean oversteer, more rotation, and softer will mean less rotation. There are two types of dampers. You can have the slow damper, slow bump, or you can have the fast one. The slow dampers are for braking, accelerating, turning, and all the weight transfer that is going around the car. This is all controlled and affected in terms of car balance by the slow dampers. The fast dampers are gonna affect when you hit a curb, or when you're jumping a little bit, or a bump, or like whenever it's something like anything that's super fast, it's gonna be affected by the fast bump. So as you can see, the effects on the fast bump are gonna be a little bit more subtle, because the big effects are on the slow bump because you're consistently transferring the weight around. And fast is important when there's vibrations, when you're landing, when you're hitting curbs consistently, and those things are gonna be affected by the fast bumps. And it's the same thing. Soften the compression to get more grip on that end, stiffen the rebound to get more grip on that end, on the other end that is lifting. The wing, we can have on the fronts either a splitter or a few gurney wings or anything, or you can have a rear wing, or both. How does the downforce levels affect the balance of the car? Essentially, we have a balance thing and we have a grip thing. So the way downforce affects balance is if you have more downforce on the fronts, you have more air pushing the car down and the car becomes more oversteery on higher speeds. But that's the thing. The effects of the wings get progressively bigger as the car gains speed. So you have like a super low speed corner, you're not gonna feel that much the difference. And if you have like a flat sixth gear corner, then you're gonna feel big time the difference of wing changes. So if, for example, you have oversteer on slow corner, you're not gonna change the wing. If you have oversteer on a slow corner, you change the ARB, you change the spring rate, you change things that are gonna be mechanical. But if you have oversteer on a high speed corner, on a fast corner, then you will increase the rear wing. Because on high speeds, if the car has way too much grip here, what you want to do is add more grip to this side. So just add more wing. But there's a problem. You will control the balance, right? So balance is more wing here, more oversteer, more wing here, more understeer. But there is also the speed effect. So if you add one wing here, one wing here, car's balanced. Okay, actually no, it's oversteer. So let's add grip here. Boom, perfect. But now I'm getting used to it. I want the car to turn more. I'm gonna add more wing at the fronts. 2. Yeah, okay, now it's a little bit too much. You know what? Let's do 2, 3. Every time you add wing, you're gonna get more drag. So the wind pushing the car down is gonna make the car slower in the straights. So things to remember about wings, it affects high speed corners a lot more than low speed corners. You might even not feel the difference that much on low speed corners. And it will slow down the car if you have too much angle. So of course, you're driving Le Mans, you want 0 wing. Is speed versus downforce linear? No, it's not. I don't remember exactly the formula, but I think it's pretty exponential actually. Like you get a lot more effects on higher speeds than on lower speeds. And again, like I told you, like if you want to really feel the effects on high speed corners, change the wing because it's gonna be very effective. But if you change the wing on lower speed corners, it's not gonna be that much. Let's test it out. Let's try. Oh, it's already on max wing. So let's try max wing with 0 wing on the fronts. So maximum rear wing, minimum front wing, which is the dive planes, the gurney, and I guess a splitter. So we expect this car to still be okay and rotating on lower speeds, but then it's gonna be very understeery on high speed stuff. Okay, so see, still turns on that one, kind of like medium to low speed corner, but I expect some understeer in the next corner. You can see my graph. I know you can probably not see my graph, but I was definitely trying to rotate the car as much as possible. Didn't happen because it's so understeer. On high speeds, there's no wing, and that's an exponential lack of downforce on the front tires. Now let's try the opposite: zero wing and max wing at the front. What we're gonna have? See, it's already alive. Already wants to go. See, it's pretty free. Why? Because now the faster I go, the more air squared is forcing the car down. So here, see, not a lot of oversteer there because still a low speed corner. But then here, I should expect more rotation. Right away, lost the rear on entry. Then the car like just started sliding sideways, but it did oversteer big time on entry. This is just part 1. We're gonna have part 2 very soon. If you have any question, leave it in the comments down below. Oh, and remember that you can gain a 10th per lap by liking and subscribing. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video and see you in the next video.